The first nail she hammered into the frozen post snapped in half, and her fingers bled through the wool gloves. But she didn't stop, because if she stopped, the cold would take her just like it took her husband, silent and merciless in the night. They heard her banging at dawn. Two men in fur coats leaned on their fence rail, chuckling over steaming mugs while she unraveled the twisted coils of wire onto the frost-hardened ground. Her name was Clara Hensley, and she'd buried her husband in the ice-packed ground 3 weeks earlier, with only the preacher and her sons watching. Now she stood alone before their sagging one-room cabin, hammering chicken wire against its splintering log walls like she was building a coop around herself. "No chickens left, lady," one man called. "Storm got 'em same as mine. That wire won't hold heat. It's not a blanket." Clara didn't look up. She couldn't afford to. The night before, her baby had gone quiet for so long she thought he'd gone cold. The stove had gone out, and the bedroom measured 6 degrees Fahrenheit by the glass thermometer hung crooked near the bunk. She'd cradled the baby wrapped in everything they owned, mouth near his ear to let him feel breath. His tiny toes felt like glass. So that morning she'd gone through the collapsed shed behind the barn, found the rusted spools left from her husband's failed fence job 2 summers back, and dragged them with frostbitten fingers through the snow. Every hour counted now, every nail, every layer. She didn't care what the wire looked like, if it did what she thought it might. If the principles her husband once mentioned about airflow and barrier layering were true, then maybe it would buy them 10 degrees, maybe 15, enough to stay asleep through the worst of it. But she had no science. Only need, and desperation would make an inventor out of any woman on the edge of freezing to death. She worked until dusk. By then, the cabin looked like some strange cage, coiled in overlapping silver mesh that clung to the walls like armor. She wrapped it tight to the logs, tacked it with scavenged nails, and in places bound it with twine soaked in oil for extra seal. She'd covered the bedroom side first, circling it 3 times. It didn't matter how ugly it looked. They'd already laughed when she shoved hay into the eaves last week, laughed when she stacked the broken door with mud and rags. Let them laugh again. That night, the wind screamed over the ridge like a thing possessed. Snow came sideways, sticking to the mesh, lodging in every curve and crevice of the wire like it had found a nest. Clara kept the stove lit low, 1 log, 2 coals, afraid to burn too hot, afraid the smoke would draw attention. But the air inside didn't freeze. The back wall of the bedroom, the one she'd wired most tightly, stayed dry. And by midnight, for the first time in 4 nights, she didn't have to keep the baby against her chest. He slept, covered, breathing. She measured the wall with her hand. It was warm, not hot, not even truly warm by most standards, but not icy, not death. The next morning, she opened the door to find the entire front face of her cabin glistening under a crust of rime. The wire shimmered like frost armor. Snow had stuck to it but hadn't passed through. Beneath the mesh, the logs were dry. The men on the hill didn't laugh that day. They stared. One even came down by midday, pretending he needed to check his trapline. "You done building your coop?" he asked, standing just outside her steps. Clara didn't answer. She was trying to work through the next problem. The wind at the foundation. Cold sank down the walls and pooled at the floor like water in a basin. Her boots touched it every night, and her oldest son had started coughing 2 days ago. "I don't suppose it's any warmer?" the man added, squinting past her into the darkness of the cabin. Clara didn't lie. "It was 26 by the glass," she said flatly, his brow wrinkled. "Wasn't but 1 degree in my place at sunrise." She didn't blink, just turned and shut the door. 3 days passed. The storm didn't. Clara rewrapped the cabin again, this time adding a second layer over the eastern wall. She used what little was left of the mesh, bending it by hand where needed, tying it with broken strands of rope and wet cloth she later froze to hold shape. She worked in silence, sometimes through snow so thick she couldn't see the trees. The other women in town were staying indoors. Clara didn't blame them, but she knew they didn't have babies to think about, or children small enough to weep in sleep. Her oldest boy, Josiah, was coughing worse now. The deep, kind, chesty, with something stuck in the breath. She placed a cloth over his mouth and tried warming stones by the stove to place at the foot of his bed, but the chill always crept in again by nightfall, until she lined the wall behind him with spare mesh and stacked dirt against the cabin from the outside. It wasn't pretty. She had to dig the soil bare-handed through snow, mud it, and press it into the gaps below the wire. Then she froze it into place. She didn't know what she was building anymore, some blend of instinct and memory. Her husband used to talk about air layering, how his grandmother in Sweden built barn sheds with straw insulation layered under slatted boards. "It ain't the heat that counts," he'd said once. "It's how long you trap it." She was trying to trap it now. That night the thermometer read 33. She cried, not out loud, just by herself in the dark, with the baby beside her, and Josiah finally breathing easier, and the little girl, Ruthie, no longer shivering under 3 blankets. 33, enough to keep skin from freezing, enough to keep them alive. But in the morning, the real storm hit, the kind of whiteout that tore shingles from cabins and lifted smoke straight sideways like God was trying to erase every sign of life on the ridge. She kept the stove going that day, burned almost every log left. By evening, she knew they wouldn't last through the next night. And then she heard the knock, not loud, a gloved hand tapping against the frame of the wire-wrapped front door. She opened it slowly, the wind slamming against the frame like an angry animal. A woman stood there, bundled head to toe, cheeks raw from cold. It was Martha Ellison, from 2 hills over. "Do you have any wire?" she asked, voice shaking. Clara blinked. Martha looked exhausted, near tears. "What? Wire?" she said again. "I can't keep the heat in. I heard yours stayed warm. My baby's blue. Do you have any more wire?" Clara stared at her a long moment. She hadn't spoken to Martha since the funeral. Most women had stayed away after that. No one wanted to be around the kind of grief Clara carried. She stepped back and nodded once. "I'll show you what I did." And by lantern light, she taught her, showed her where to wrap, how to knot the mesh into corners, how to seal it with packed snow and dirt. She gave her a spool and a handful of the twine-wrapped cords she'd prepared as backup. When Martha left that night, her eyes were different, not grateful, something else, a kind of desperation that felt all too familiar. Clara watched her vanish into the snow, and for the first time in weeks she realized how many cabins stood on the hill, all empty-eyed, all cold, and she knew what was coming. By morning, 3 more women had come, one with her shawl half frozen to her shoulders, another guiding a boy so small he could barely stand upright in the snow, and the last dragging a broken sled with splinters of lumber strapped to it like a coffin. Clara didn't recognize them all at first. Some lived down past the creek bend, others were from the far ridge, but she knew the look, that half-mad, bone-deep stare of a mother watching cold pick her children off one cough at a time. None of them brought words. They only stood in the snow beside her cabin, eyes locked on the glittering armor she'd nailed to the logs. The wind howled, slicing sideways across the hill, but the wire held the snow like a second skin. Clara knew it hadn't fixed everything, but it had slowed the death, and sometimes that was enough. She stepped out in her coat, pulled her scarf up, and gave them what little instruction she could. There was no pride in it, no satisfaction, only urgency. She passed out what nails she had left, let them trace their fingers along the seams of the wire and the frozen mud packed between. She explained how she'd bent the wire over the edges of the logs to trap snow, how she froze rags into sealant. One woman asked if it had really warmed the room. "My baby lived," Clara said. "That's all I know." The others didn't question her again. By the second week, the wire cabins had begun to spread. Not pretty, not neat, but they rose like strange iron-clad beetles hunkered against the storm. Some used fencing scrap, others tore apart old cages and window grates. One woman melted tin and poured it into corner cracks. They stitched together ideas like cloth, repurposing every last twisted coil of metal they could find. And under it all, they packed dirt, frozen straw, rags soaked in rainwater and turned to ice, anything that could block the air. The men didn't laugh anymore, they just watched. Even John Merritt, who once said no woman had business using hammer and wire without a man around, now stood at the corner of Clara's yard, asking what gauge mesh she'd used. She didn't answer, didn't have to. He already had a roll of chicken wire over his shoulder. The real cold came that Sunday, no warning, just a deep drop in the air so sharp it cracked branches before dawn, the kind of drop that makes your breath freeze inside your nose before you exhale. Josiah woke coughing blood. Clara felt his forehead and found it ice-slick with sweat, even in the warmest part of the cabin. She dragged a box of coals into the room and packed stones around it to hold the heat. Then she wrapped the stones in burlap and laid them under his bunk. She didn't sleep, just watched his little chest rise and fall, counting every breath. Outside, the storm turned from wind to silence, that terrifying stillness of absolute freeze. At midday, Martha came again. Her eyes were red, and she was shaking. "He won't wake up," she whispered. "My boy, his lips." Clara didn't let her finish. She grabbed her satchel, what little dry cloth she had, and followed. Martha's cabin was barely holding. The wire was too thin, sagging in places, and one wall had blown open under wind. Clara stuffed the seams with snow and rags as best she could. Inside, the child lay under 4 quilts, but looked waxy and still. Clara touched his wrist, faint pulse. "Heat the floor," Clara said. "Stones, wrapped, get coals under, then pull the bed closer to the wall." The wire wall, It's warmer there. Martha moved like she was dreaming, but she obeyed. They worked in silence, breath misting, hands trembling. The stove crackled faintly. Not enough heat, but enough to keep breath visible. By nightfall, the boys stirred. Not much, just a blink, a moan, but Clara knew that sound. It was the sound of someone turning back toward life. She left quietly, walking back in darkness, lanterns swinging low. Snow fell softly now, coating the cabins like shrouds. The wire glistened all around, not just on her home, but everywhere. At least a dozen others had followed her method now, and more would soon. She felt none of the pride the men must have expected, just weariness, just grief, because in her mind, she still heard her husband's voice, calm and warm from that summer long past. You build it right, it'll hold. Doesn't take money, just time, just thinking through what the cold wants and how to block it. He hadn't been a builder. He hadn't even finished the fence job he'd started. But she remembered the way he'd spoken about air and layers, and how you could trick the elements if you just understood their patterns. And now, all that forgotten knowledge, all those half-remembered thoughts from a dead man's mouth, were keeping children from turning to ice in their sleep. By midweek, the valley faced its worst freeze in 12 years. 2 cabins collapsed. 1 fire spread after a flue cracked. A woman's boots froze to the floorboards overnight. Another was found walking through the snow barefoot with her baby, screaming that the walls had begun to breathe cold, and still the wire cabins held. Clara's thermometer hit 38 one morning, the warmest since the storm began. She used the moment to dig out the side of her root cellar and wrap it with wire too. A crude job, but effective. She sealed the base with frozen mud and laid ash across the snow line to create a reflective shield, another one of her husband's half-taught tricks. He used to say that even cold had mirrors if you angled the earth right. By then, people had started calling her place the cage. It wasn't meant as insult anymore. It was reverence. She didn't want it, didn't need it. All she wanted was to survive. But soon they started coming in pairs, with children, with mothers, with injured men too weak to keep fires burning. They asked if they could warm stones by her hearth, if they could dry cloth, if they could borrow coals. She gave what she had, carefully, measured, but never turning them away. The woman who once buried her husband alone now found herself surrounded by a strange community, not one of comfort or noise, but of silence and need. No one talked about the weather. No one talked about the men who still refused to listen, still claimed the cold was just the cold, and wire wouldn't change a thing. But Clara saw them too, standing behind cracked shutters, watching their wives wrap logs in rags and stack snow around the cabin base to mimic what the women had built. She saw them copying, even while pretending not to. On the 12th night of the storm, Clara woke to Ruthie's cry, not from cold, but from light. A glow flickered outside the window. Fire? She rushed to the front, pulled the door open against the wind. A cabin down the hill was ablaze, not fully, just the front corner, but enough to send plumes of smoke curling into the white night. A man screamed. The wind caught the flames, pushed them toward the roof. People scrambled in the snow, throwing shovels of powder, blankets, anything. But the fire licked upward fast. Clara didn't think. She threw her boots on, grabbed her pail, and sprinted. The fire wasn't from the stove. It had started from a bundle of rags packed too close to a spark hole, part of a failed insulation effort gone wrong. Someone had tried to mimic the method, but without understanding the layers. No wire, no seal, just flammable hope. It took them an hour to smother the flames. By then, the corner of the cabin had collapsed, and the cold was already flooding in. Clara stood there, soaking wet, hair stiff with ice. The man whose house had burned stared at her, shaking. I didn't mean, I just thought. She didn't answer. There was nothing to say. He hadn't asked, hadn't listened, just grabbed whatever he could find and stuffed it in the walls. A mistake that nearly took his family. That night, 5 people slept in her cabin. She gave them coals, fed them broth, wrapped their feet, watched them breathe, and in the corner of her mind, she began sketching something new, a real lining, a method, not just wire now, but how to layer it, how to keep fire out, heat in. She didn't know why she was thinking like this, except that maybe the next time someone asked, she wouldn't just show them scars and nails. She'd show them how to build it right. The morning after the fire, Clara stood in the snow, alone again, but not quite. The cabins across the hill no longer looked like homesteads. They looked like relics, strange metallic cocoons glinting under frost-crusted sunlight. Wire, twine, frozen dirt, soot from burned rags, layers of straw and snow packed around walls, like the town had armored itself against a war. Because it had. No army, no raiders, but something colder, slower, the kind of siege that doesn't knock on the door but seeps under it and waits. Clara stepped back inside and closed her door gently. Josiah was still sleeping, his face flush for once. Ruthie sat on the floor playing with a small rag doll, and the baby, silent in his bundle, blinked with curiosity instead of that vacant, freezing stare she had grown to fear. 39 degrees in the bedroom. She pressed her hand against the inner wall, warm to the touch, not by fire, but by retained breath, blocked drafts, the slow heat trapped between wire and logs. It was working, and that terrified her, because if it was working this well, then the others would keep coming. More cabins meant more mouths, more wood burned, more need, and Clara didn't have more to give. She had salvaged every last nail, stripped her own barn for mesh, and frozen her knuckles raw just keeping up with what little her family needed. She went out again by midday and found a dozen people clustered down the hill near what remained of the burned cabin. The front corner was blackened, but the back wall still stood. A woman, barely older than Clara, thin as a reed, one baby on her hip and another clinging to her skirt, kept repeating the same sentence to whoever would listen. "I just did what Martha said. She said to stuff rags, she said." Martha was there too, her mouth pale, her eyes wide. "I didn't tell her to put it near the flue," Martha muttered. I said insulate the base, not the chimney." "She didn't know the difference," one man barked. "You're all playing engineer out here with wire and dirt and kids dying. You want to turn the whole ridge into a funeral row?" Clara stepped in then. Not loud, not dramatic, just clear. "Then maybe stop copying what you don't understand." The words cut like flint. The man turned, face dark. "What's that mean?" "It means if you're going to copy what we build," she said, gesturing toward the surrounding cabins, "then stop pretending you know how to do it just by looking." Another voice joined in, not Clara's. "I didn't know either," Martha said. "Clara showed me. I did what she said, and it worked." "You burned down your neighbor's house," the man snapped. "She didn't," Clara said. "The woman did, because she rushed. She got scared, and she stuffed a draft hole without knowing where the heat goes." There was silence, not agreement but fear. Fear of the storm, of the cold, of mistakes. Clara exhaled slowly. "If we don't teach each other the right way to do it, this'll keep happening." One of the older women, Mrs. Devereux, whose cabin sat lowest near the tree line, stepped forward then, shoulders hunched in her fur-lined coat. "Then teach us." The words hung like frost in the air. Clara wanted to say no. She wasn't a teacher. She was just a widow with nothing left to lose. But then she looked around, at the children, at the bare hands and patched boots, at the half-wired cabins slouching under ice, and she saw it for what it was, a village trying not to die. She cleared the space in her barn first, swept it bare, dug out the snow that had drifted in through the cracked shingles, and set up an old crate as a table. The wire wasn't much, only a few feet of twisted chicken mesh left, but it was enough to show what mattered. By lantern light, she began teaching, not in words but motion, how to bend the mesh so it curved around corners without breaking, how to freeze dirt into mortar, how to wrap twine soaked in water so it sealed shut when the temperature dropped. She showed where to layer, how many inches of space mattered, how to keep ventilation without giving the cold a road in. It wasn't science, but it was survival. Every night the barn filled, first women, then a few boys, then 2 men, quiet, suspicious, their eyes hard but curious. One of them had lost a child the week before. Clara didn't ask how. She taught for 5 nights. Then she stopped. Because someone stole from her. It wasn't a mystery. She found the wire missing from behind the stove, the last roll, the one she'd set aside for Ruthie's corner. Gone, the nails too, and a lantern. No note, no apology, just vanished. Clara stood in the empty barn that morning, staring at the bare hook where the mesh once hung. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, from rage. Ruthie's corner was the coldest in the house. She'd planned to double wrap it tonight before the next storm front hit. Now she had nothing left to seal it with. No firewood, no wire, no time. She stormed down the hill, didn't knock, didn't ask, just marched straight into the first new cabin wrapped in gleaming mesh, and found herself face to face with a young man named Elijah Turner, barely 20. Single, always sneering, and now, suddenly warm. Clara's voice was low. "You took it." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Took what?" "My role? My nails? Don't play dumb," he shrugged, stepping back. "It's cold, lady. You said anyone could build. I said I'd teach." He glanced around his cabin, where the walls were now fully wired, layered better than they had been just yesterday. He hadn't even done it right. The gaps were inconsistent, the seams sagging where he hadn't reinforced with rags. "You got yours," he said. "We're all freezing." Clara stared at him. "No," she said. "Not all of us. Just the ones who don't listen." She turned and left. She didn't go home. She went to the ridge, where the creek ran frozen and the wind hit hardest, and sat there with her scarf over her mouth, and her fury boiling up inside. She wasn't angry about the wire. She was angry that this had become the new way of life, that people now stole warmth like it was gold, that even her dead husband's buried ideas were now currency, that she was being bled dry to keep others alive, while her own children still slept one bad night away from freezing. But then she heard crunching behind her, footsteps, small. She turned to find Ruthie. The little girl's cheeks were pink, her breath puffing like smoke, but her eyes were clear. She held out something with both hands, a roll of wire. Clara blinked. "Where? Mrs. Devereux," Ruthie whispered. "She said someone gave her two. I told her we didn't have any now." Clara took it slowly. The wire was old, bent but usable. She held her daughter close, buried her face in her coat. That night she didn't teach. She stayed home and wrapped Ruthie's wall, 3 layers, no shortcuts. And the bedroom held steady at 41 degrees until dawn. After that, Clara changed how she taught. No more free-for-all lessons. No more showing every hand to strangers. She drew diagrams on old flour sacks, tacked them to the barn walls, created a system. First come, first taught, one lesson at a time. You had to bring something in trade, not money, just respect. A shovel, a cord of wood, a spool of twine, something to prove you weren't just another thief. She didn't smile, didn't offer warmth, but she gave knowledge. The women came, they learned, they carried it back to their families, and the cabins held. The wire glimmered across the valley now like silver veins. The whole town a strange patchwork of cold ingenuity and grief-forged resilience. Clara watched it grow from her window, saw the changes, noticed the children coughing less, the smoke rising in steadier curls, the laughter, faint, distant, of someone splitting ice for water without weeping. The cold hadn't left, but neither had they. That was something. Then came the day when someone from out of town rode in, wrapped in furs, face nearly hidden, horse half dead from the cold. The stranger dismounted in front of the church and collapsed before anyone could ask who he was. He carried a map and a question. He'd heard of the wire cabins. He wanted to know how they were built. The stranger's name was Callum Rye. He was from over the pass, a logging camp nearly 60 miles west, tucked in a narrow valley along the river forks where the trees stood thick and the storms lasted longer. He hadn't come alone either. He'd left with 4 men, all riding mules. Only one mule made it back. The others had frozen along the trail. It took Clara 2 hours to learn this. The man couldn't speak at first, frostbite on his lips, barely breathing. But once warmed and fed, the story came out in strange fits. He didn't talk like the valley folk. His accent was sharper, hung with the mountain dialect, but his meaning was clear. They were dying. His whole camp, half the shacks had collapsed. The wood stoves couldn't hold heat. They'd heard, from a trader, about a woman wrapping cabins in wire mesh and keeping rooms 30–40 degrees warmer with barely a fire lit. Clara hadn't known anyone was talking outside the valley, but apparently they were. Callum pulled out a half-frozen sheet of parchment with smudged charcoal markings, crude sketches of wire around a cabin, dotted arrows toward the windbreak side, notes scrawled in a hand, desperate to remember. "We tried it," he rasped. "Didn't have much wire, but tried. It helped. Not enough. We need to know how. We need the real way. Please." Clara didn't answer. Not right away. She was standing in the church vestibule, the wind blowing in through the cracks in the stained glass above. Callum sat hunched on the bench near the stove, shivering even with the blankets. Outside, a dozen faces pressed against the fogged windows, watching. Word spread fast now. Clara wasn't sure how she felt about that. She stepped out alone, shutting the door behind her. The air was bitter again. Another front was pushing through. The wire around her cabin had held through 4 such fronts now. But how long would it last? She didn't know. Every layer she added was a guess, not a guarantee. And yet these people were treating her like she had answers worth crossing mountains for. She didn't. She had pain and instinct, but they were all she had left. The town gathered that night, not in the saloon. It was too cold now, with broken windows and the stove out of coal. They packed instead into the church, sitting under cracked beams and between rows of mismatched chairs. Some brought lanterns, others candles. Someone even dragged in a crate of warm stones to keep children's feet from freezing. Clara hadn't planned to speak, but the room was looking at her like they expected it. Callum sat in the front row, bandaged hands trembling. Clara stepped forward, eyes fixed on the floorboards. "I didn't invent anything," she said. "I just remembered what my husband said about cold, about layering. He used to talk about how even barns stayed warmer if you trapped the air inside. He didn't live long enough to try it. I did." She looked up slowly. "It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. And if there's another place out there where children are turning blue in their sleep, then maybe it's worth teaching." A low murmur passed through the pews. Then the town elder, old Simon Dirth, whose wife had died last spring, raised a hand. "You could write it down," he said. "Every step, so it don't get misused again, like it did with that fire." Clara nodded once. I'll write it. Then what? Someone called. Clara hesitated. The truth was, she didn't know what came next. She hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't set out to be a teacher or a leader. She'd just been trying to save her babies. But now her name was being spoken beyond the ridge. Now her cold, scabbed fingers were seen as some kind of map. I'll write it, she said again, firmer. And if they want to come here to learn, they come quiet. No stealing, no fighting. They help us build. They leave with what we give. A few men nodded. Some women clapped softly. But most just sat there, stunned. Because in that moment it became clear to all of them. This wasn't just about surviving the winter anymore. This was about what came after. The following days blurred together. The temperature dropped again, -20 on some nights. But the cabins held. Clara wrote in the barn, scribbling everything she remembered on flour sacks, potato paper, and even bark when parchment ran out. She wrote down how to bend the wire so it hugged corners, how to pack snow into sealant instead of cloth when rags were short, how to use fire ash as wind insulation, how to keep oxygen flow without creating draft. She didn't write like a scientist. She wrote like a mother, desperate to make sure no one buried their baby alone. Callum stayed for 3 days. He watched her teach others. He helped stack firewood. He didn't talk much, but when he left, he had a saddlebag full of notes and a promise. I'll bring you more wire, he said. More than you need. Clara didn't expect him to keep it, but a week later, he returned, this time with 2 men, 4 mules, and a rusted wagon load of fencing scrap. He wasn't the only one. Other visitors came, one from the South Bend, where the river froze in a strange pattern and carried wind like a blade. Another from the High Valley, where cattle died in rows last month. They came dirty, weak, too skinny to have survived much longer, and they brought stories. One spoke of a child saved by a cabin copycat who'd tried Clara's layering system with flour sacks instead of wire. Another told of a widow who used sheep's wool soaked in brine and froze it against the cabin walls in a half-successful mimic of the wire method. Every story was different, but the outcome was the same. They stayed alive. Clara's cabin changed too. Josiah stopped coughing. Ruthie ran again. And the baby? He started to smile. Clara reinforced their walls with new wire, newer even than what she'd started with. She added a secondary layer inside the ceiling, using burlap stuffed with feathers donated by another mother. The bedroom hit 45 degrees and held. Neighbors started copying again, but now they asked first, and always they offered something in return. Stones, tools, meat. One man even carved a wind vane from scrap wood and mounted it to her roof, claiming it would help her track the fronts. She didn't stop teaching. She couldn't. Every day someone else needed to learn. She stopped counting how many. They called her the Wire Widow now, not in mockery, but with awe. And sometimes, late at night, she'd step outside and look across the snow-packed valley where the once humble cabins of a dying town now shimmered in the moonlight like armored hulks, silver-veined, snow-crusted, glowing with faint yellow warmth. She'd see them and think, we did this. Not alone. Never alone. They built something more than cabins. They built a way to survive. And yet, winter wasn't done. Not yet. A new storm was forming over the pass, and it wouldn't be like the last ones. The storm didn't arrive with noise. It came as stillness first. 3 days of eerie quiet. No wind, no movement in the trees, no birdsong. Just a sky like wet slate and snow too soft to crunch. The kind of hush that settles before something breaks. Clara felt it in her chest before she saw it. That aching tightness, like a warning her bones knew before her eyes caught up. She stood by the cabin door the morning it began, her breath fogging the glass, and watched the trees bend just slightly in one direction. Then the first gust hit. A low groan rolled through the hills like thunder buried beneath ice, and the wind came in as if the world itself had drawn a blade. Clara ducked as the gust lifted a cloud of snow so fine it seemed like smoke, a silver veil tearing across the ridge. The cabin shuddered once, not badly, but enough to make the lamp sway. She moved fast. Ruthie was already crying, sensing the pressure shift. Josiah sat up, coughing, the cold tickling his lungs again, and the baby whimpered from the corner. Clara slammed the door shut and began checking every seam, every corner, every place where air might sneak through. This was no ordinary front. She could feel it in her blood. By midday, the wire mesh sang. It had never done that before. The tension in it, how it pulled against nails, how it creaked and moaned like 1,000 winter voices humming in harmony. It wasn't breaking, but it was alive. Neighbors ran cabin to cabin, wrapping new layers, tying spare cloth across windows, adding snow to the bases in frantic scoops. Clara saw Mrs. Devereux tripping through thigh-deep drifts with a basket full of ash, screaming for help as her chimney cracked in the wind. She helped where she could, But by nightfall, it became clear this was the test. Not for the wire, not for the method, but for the people. How they'd hold together or fall apart. The wind didn't stop for 4 days. 4 days of non-stop shrieking through the trees, of roofs threatening to lift, of cold so deep it didn't sting anymore. It just made your thoughts move slower. Clara fed the stove constantly, rationing wood until only a few logs remained. Then she switched to bark, then dry cloth, then pine cones gathered in summer and forgotten until now. Inside the cabin, the bedroom stayed at 35 degrees. Not warm, but not death. Josiah curled in his bed, too weak to play, but no longer coughing blood. Ruthie stayed bundled, and Clara turned their bed into a cave, draping rugs across chairs, placing stones beneath their blankets, burning the last candle for light. Every morning she expected to see frost inside the glass. Every morning it stayed clear. The wire held. The mesh, packed now in 4 layers on the west side, sang with the storm. The snow collected in thick ridges along its edge, not seeping in, not soaking the logs, but sticking like armor to a wall. It was working. It was still working. But outside, others weren't so lucky. The town lost 3 cabins. 2 collapsed under snow load. Their roofs rotted from within. 1 caught fire again, not from foolishness this time, but from a flue driven back by the wind, choking the heat until it turned inward. Clara heard the screams. She ran, even when she shouldn't have. She tied Ruthie to her chest with rope, handed Josiah a sack of stones to heat, and left the baby with Mrs. Merritt, who had 4 children of her own, and 2 spare arms to hold another. She ran through the night to help, not because she knew how to fix burning roofs, but because no one else could. In the end, it wasn't Clara who saved the burning cabin. It was Elijah Turner, the same boy who'd once stolen her last roll of wire, now stood in the snow, shirtless, using the top of a steel pail to beat down the flames. His cabin had survived the last storm, and something in him had changed. He saw her and didn't smirk this time. He shouted, "Bring snow! The back wall's catching!" Together they smothered it. Elijah tore part of his roof down with his bare hands to stop the fire from spreading. Clara wrapped him in rags when it was over. His fingers were black with soot, but his voice was steady. "You were right," he said. "I was just scared." Clara nodded once. That night, 6 cabins crammed into 3. The town huddled. They pulled up floors to burn. They passed stones like gold. They made ash beds beneath bunks and prayed over kindling. But none of the wire cabins failed. None. Even when the wind blew so hard it peeled paint from the church steeple, the mesh held. It didn't matter if it was old or new, thin or rusted. What mattered was how it was placed, how it was sealed, how it was layered with snow and dirt and cloth, and all the other secrets Clara had taught through frozen breath and grief. When the storm broke, really broke, it was almost anticlimactic. Just silence again. Sunlight pouring down through clouds like it had never left. Snowdrifts higher than rooftops. Trees snapped in half like matchsticks. And smoke, slow, curling, steady, from the few chimneys that had survived. Clara stood in the snow outside her cabin. Her coat was too big now. She hadn't eaten properly in days, but she smiled anyway, because across the valley, wire shimmered like 1,000 spiderwebs cast in steel, proof that they hadn't just survived the cold, they'd beaten it. Ruthie ran to her, bundled in scarves, her boots too big, Josiah following behind with red cheeks and clear eyes. "Mama," she called, "the sun's back." Clara crouched low, arms open. "I see it, baby." They held each other a long time. Then she turned and looked up the ridge. 3 new figures were walking down, newcomers, from the west, or maybe further, bundled strangers with rope-tied packs and stiff legs. They came slowly, and Clara knew what they were going to ask. She stood and waited, and when they got close, one of them pulled out a roll of wire from their satchel, dented, bent, but intact, and held it out. "I heard you can teach." Clara looked at the wire, then at the faces behind it, then down at her children. She nodded. "You bring anything else?" she asked. The man blinked. "A little twine, some nails." Clara smiled faintly. "Then let's begin." The cabin was no longer hers alone. It had become a school, a gathering point, a strange outpost of warmth in a world still cloaked in cold. No one laughed at the wire anymore. No one called it foolish. They wrapped it now with reverence, like prayers etched in steel. Because somewhere in that frost-bitten winter, a widow's desperation had turned into a doctrine, and the bedroom that once froze a baby nearly to death now stayed 35 degrees warmer than the air outside, every night, without fail, because she had refused to freeze, and because she had taught others to do the same.